So we left off talking about the Gaspee. This is the British customs ship that was really successful at catching smugglers in the early 1770s. It's in 1772 when the ship ran aground off the shore of Rhode Island, and a group of colonists disguised as American Indians ordered the British crew ashore, and then they set fire to the ship. The British ordered a commission to investigate and bring the guilty individuals to Britain for the trial. Similar, the Boston Tea Party, where the colonists had continued their refusal to buy British tea, and also because the British insisted on their right to collect their taxes. Hoping to help the British East India Company out of its financial problems, Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773. This made the price of the British East India Company's tea, even with the tax included, cheaper than anything that was smuggled as Dutch tea. Many Americans refused to buy the cheaper tea, because to do so would, in effect, recognize Parliament's right to tax the colonies. So a shipment of the East India Company's tea arrived in Boston Harbor, and there were no buyers. Before the royal government could arrange to bring the tea ashore, a group of Bostonians, again disguised as American Indians, boarded the British ships and dumped almost 350 chests of tea into the harbor. The colonial reaction to the incident was really mixed. Many applauded the Boston Tea Party as a justifiable defense of liberty. Others thought the destruction of private property was just far too radical. But we start to see this shift here, just a small cultural detail, as Americans stop drinking so much tea in protest to the Tea Act, which makes them a little less British and a little more American. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament decides to retaliate. It's in retaliation that the British government enacted a series of punitive acts. They call these the Coercive Acts, and they also passed the Quebec Act. The colonists are outraged by these laws, so they call them the Intolerable Acts because they were so intolerable. There's actually 4 coercive acts. They're directed mainly at punishing the people of Boston and Massachusetts and bringing the dissidents under control. When it passed the coercive acts, the British government also passed a law organizing the Canadian lands gained from France. The Quebec Act, so it's reorganized this land that was gained from France. It's accepted by most of the French Canadians, but it's going to be rejected by many of the 13 colonies. Because the Quebec Act established Roman Catholicism as the official religion of Quebec. And it set up a government without a representative assembly and extended Quebec's boundary to the Ohio River. So the colonists viewed the Quebec Act as a direct attack on the American colonies because it took away lands that they claimed along the Ohio River. They also feared that the British would attempt to enact similar laws in America to take away their representative government. So you've got a predominantly Protestant American population, and so they resented the recognition that was given to Catholicism. Then we've got this whole Age of Enlightenment that's going on in Europe. I'm just going to talk a little bit about 2 different people, these Enlightenment thinkers. For Americans, especially those who are interested in positions of leadership, there's sort of a long tradition of loyalty to the king and to England. As these differences grew, many Americans searched for an explanation and justification for the changing relationship. In the 18th century, some educated Americans were attracted to a European movement in literature and philosophy known as the Enlightenment. The leaders of this movement really believed that the darkness of past ages could be corrected by the use of human reason.
Excuse the interruption. Jan Platinum, please come to the clinic. Jan Platinum, please come to the clinic.
So a major influence on the Enlightenment and on American thinking is the work of John Locke. He's a 17th century English philosopher and a political theorist. Locke reasoned that while the state is supreme, or the government is supreme, it is bound to follow natural rights, natural laws. These natural laws are based on the rights that people have simply because they are human, like life, liberty, and property. Furthermore, citizens also have the right and obligation to abolish a government that fails to protect their rights. Other Enlightenment philosophers adopted and expounded on Locke's ideas. His stress on natural rights will provide a rationale for the American Revolution.
Platinum Young, you're needed in the clinic. Platinum Young, you're needed in the clinic.
So Parliament's passage of the Intolerable Acts intensified the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. It's in the next 2 years that many Americans will reach the conclusion, even though it was unthinkable a few years earlier, that the only real solution to their quarrel with the British government was to sever all ties with it. So let's look at how the events from 1774 to 1776 led ultimately to the revolutionary outcome. The harsh and really punitive nature of the Intolerable Acts drove all the colonies except Georgia to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia in September of 1774, the First Continental Congress. The purpose of the convention was to determine how the colonies should react to what, from their viewpoint, seemed to pose an alarming threat to their rights and liberties. It's at this time that most Americans had no desire for independence. They simply wanted to protest all of these parliamentary intrusions on their rights. They wanted to restore the relationship with the crown that had existed before the French and Indian War. The delegates that are at the First Continental Congress are a really diverse group. Their views about the crisis will range from radical to conservative. This is where you have people like Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, John Dickinson, John Jay, all of these different people who will later be called the founding fathers of our nation. The Congress is going to propose a series of measures. Each one of these measures was intended to change British policy without offending any of the moderate or conservative opinions that were at the Continental Congress. There's a plan that's proposed very similar to the Albany Plan of 1754 that would have kind of reordered retaliations with Parliament and formed a union of the colonies within the British Empire. This plan actually kind of fails to pass, and instead the First Continental Congress does a couple other things. So the Suffolk Resolves are adopted. These were originally enacted in Massachusetts. They formally reject the Intolerable Acts, and they call for the immediate repeal of the Intolerable Acts. It really is a measure that urged the various colonies to resist the Intolerable Acts formally. And it encourages them to make military preparations and apply economic sanctions, these boycotts, against Great Britain. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances is a petition to the king that urged him to redress colonial grievances, restore colonial rights. There's also a group that forms called the Association that urged the creation of committees in every town to enforce the non-importation agreements, the boycotts, the economic sanctions. So one thing the First Continental Congress decides finally is that if colonial rights were not recognized, then a final measure would call for the meeting of a second Congress a few months later, so in May of 1775. So, angrily dismissing that Declaration of Rights and Grievances from the First Continental Congress, the king declared that government was in a state of rebellion. And they also sent additional troops to that colony to deal with any further disorders that might arise. The combination of colonial defiance and British determination to suppress it would lead to violent clashes in Massachusetts and would eventually prove to be the first battles of the American Revolution. It's on April 18th of 1775 that General Thomas Gage, the commander of the British troops in Boston, would send a large force to seize the colonial military supplies in the town of Concord. They were warned that the British were coming their way by Paul Revere. So the militia, the colonial militia, also called the Minutemen because they were ready in a minute's notice. They decided to assemble in Lexington on the village green to really face off with the British. Those Americans were forced to retreat because they're under heavy British fire. 8 people were actually killed. Nobody knows who fired that first shot, so that's why they call it the shot heard around the world. And so then the British march onward from Lexington to Concord, where they destroyed more military supplies. And it's on the return march to Boston that long column of British soldiers is then attacked by hundreds of militiamen. And that's when the British suffer alarming casualties, and that's really considered a colonial victory. So the Second Continental Congress will meet soon after the fighting breaks out in Massachusetts. The Congress is divided between kind of one group of delegates from New England who thought the colonies should declare their independence, and this other group of colonies. Mostly those are the middle colonies who sort of hoped the conflict could be resolved by negotiating a new relationship with Great Britain. So the Congress will adopt this idea of a declaration to take up arms. George Washington is appointed as the commander-in-chief of a brand new colonial army. George Washington is then sent to Boston to lead the militia and to try to gather more volunteers from other colonies. Congress also adopts another force under Benedict Arnold, who's supposed to raid Quebec and then draw Canada away from that British Empire. The Congress also adopted this idea called the Olive Branch Petition. It's really controversial because there's so much disagreement over whether or not there should be independence or not. Because many in the colonies didn't really want independence, because they valued kind of their British heritage and their British protection, they send this Olive Branch Petition to King George III. In this petition, they pledge their loyalty. They ask the king to intercede with Parliament and to secure peace and then protect their rights. But King George is really angry about it. He dismisses the plea. He instead comes up with this prohibitory act. Excuse me, I can't talk today. This declares all of the colonies in rebellion. So basically, some historians argue that because of his prohibitory act, King George actually is the one who is responsible for the American Revolution, because the colonists extended the olive branch and King George came back and said, no, you're all in rebellion, you're all in trouble. And then early in the next year, 1776, there's a pamphlet that's published called Common Sense. It has a profound impact on public opinion. It's nice and short. It's written by Thomas Paine. He's just an immigrant to the colonies, but he argues really strongly for what then was really considered a radical idea, where he argues that the colonies should separate from Great Britain, and that it doesn't make any sense to be governed by a king who's an ocean away. And it's Thomas Jefferson, who sits down later that same year, and he takes ideas from Thomas Paine and ideas from John Locke, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson formed